The Connecticut River Valley, stretching through the heart of New England, is known for its quiet majesty, its covered bridges, and its profound rural peace. But for one terrifying decade, this pastoral backdrop was stalked by a predator whose signature was unfettered personal rage. This was the Connecticut River Valley Killer, who claimed the lives of at least 7 innocent young women between 1978 and 1988. The initial attacks seemed unconnected, spread out across years in the sparsely populated region. This made it difficult for law enforcement across state lines to immediately realize they were facing a common perpetrator. The terror began in the autumn of 1978 with 27-year-old Catherine Milliken. She was an avid photographer and was last seen near the Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve in New London, New Hampshire, where she had gone to photograph birds. Her body was discovered bearing a brutal signature that would define the predator's future crimes. She had been stabbed at least 29 times. This overwhelming degree of violence immediately suggested a deeply personal or rage-driven motivation. This led to the authorities looking deeply into people she was close to, but one by one, everyone was ruled out. 3 years passed before the next confirmed victim. In July 1981, 37-year-old Mary Elizabeth Critchley, a University of Vermont student, disappeared. She had been hitchhiking near Interstate 91, close to the Massachusetts-Vermont border, traveling north toward Waterbury in Vermont. Her body was later recovered in what would later be seen as a growing pattern of violence, targeting women alone near major transportation corridors in the remote area. However, at that time, no one had made the connection between the two attacks, which were separated by both time and geography. The first sign of significant acceleration in these attacks came in 1984. In May of that year, Bernice Courtemanche, a 17-year-old high school student, vanished after being last seen by her boyfriend's mother in Claremont, New Hampshire. The killings intensified dramatically in the mid-'80s, forcing investigators to confront the shocking truth. A serial predator was operating with impunity in their rural communities. The definitive realization began with the discovery of clustered remains, demonstrating a clear pattern in victim disposal. In 1985 and 1986, the skeletal remains of 2 different victims were recovered, chillingly, within only 1,000 feet of each other in a wooded area near Kellyville, New Hampshire. Forensic examination confirmed both women had died from multiple stab wounds, definitively linking them to the violent modus operandi established in the earlier cases. The proximity of the dump sites strongly implied the predator had a fixed zone of operation and felt secure using these remote spots repeatedly. His boldness peaked during this period, signaling an escalation in his compulsion. Between the recovery of those 2 bodies, the pattern drastically changed when a 36-year-old woman in Saxons River, Vermont, was fatally stabbed inside her own home. This high-risk aggression, a substantial leap from opportunistic roadside abduction, signified a major psychological shift for the perpetrator. Home invasions carry a much higher risk of forensic evidence being left behind, and also entail a much greater risk to the predator. This suggests that his compulsion had overridden his fear of capture or his self-preservation instincts, and he could no longer wait for an opportunistic encounter. Just 10 days after this highly aggressive Vermont attack, the remains of yet another missing woman were found, again showing the clear evidence of stab wounds. The rapid succession and consistent method of death provided undeniable proof to investigators that they were dealing with a single active serial offender. Without a named perpetrator, investigators notably had to rely on the expertise of criminal profilers to figure out what sort of deranged dude they were chasing. The resulting profile suggests a predator who was intensely angry and utilized control through physical domination, culminating in extreme violence. This anger and loss of control in his personal life seemed to be the engine of the entire spree, according to the profilers. Profilers suggest that this sick puppy enjoyed the quote-unquote emotional release from the extended act of stabbing. Further, his choice of a knife rather than a gun indicated that he truly wanted to revel in the up-close and personal prolonged nature of the act. They even suggested that this was an alternative form of a quote-unquote release for this predator, if you catch my drift. The entire pattern of violence abruptly ceased in August 1988 after the attacker encountered 30-year-old Jane Borowski. Borowski, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, survived 27 stab wounds. Her escape was pivotal. The attack stopped, suggesting her survival terrified the perpetrator. For a killer who had operated with total anonymity for a decade, the existence of a living eyewitness capable of generating a clear composite sketch represented an existential threat. Crucially, Borowski's detailed memory enabled the creation of a composite sketch, giving law enforcement the first and only visual image of the man who tormented the region. Around 2006, a prominent theory emerged linking the attacks to Michael Nicolou, a man who had died in 2005 after slaying his wife and stepdaughter. This was largely based on his history of violence and his geographical proximity to the attacks, but there was immediately a problem with this hypothesis. Jane Borowski, the sole survivor, has publicly stated in interviews that, after reviewing the evidence and considering the terrifying details of her encounter, she doesn't believe it was him. Her denial, based on the intimate knowledge of the attacker's appearance and demeanor during the life-and-death struggle, effectively halts the closure offered by this theory. At present, the cases of all the women remain unsolved, with some believing that the earlier attacks and the home invasion may not be part of the same cluster of slayings. In 1988, an unidentified serial perpetrator is believed to have slain at least 9 women and caused the disappearances of 2 others in Massachusetts. This individual has become known to law enforcement and the general public as the New Bedford Highway Killer. The victims were primarily companionship workers struggling with addiction and were discovered along and around major highways, notably Interstate 195 and Route 140. Robin Rhodes, 29, is believed to have gone missing sometime in March or April 1988. She was eventually discovered on March 28, 1989, along Massachusetts Route 140 southbound in Freetown by a search dog. Unlike most of the other women, she was not known to be involved in illicit activities, though she was known to associate with people who were. Rochelle Doparala, 28, disappeared sometime during late April 1988. On December 10, 1988, her body was discovered by people riding ATVs in a gravel pit along Reed Road, about 2 miles from Interstate 195. In May 1988, 25-year-old Deborah Lynn McConnell of Newport was last seen by her father following her mother's funeral. She is considered to be the 3rd victim. A cadaver dog found her body on December 1, 1988, off Massachusetts Route 140 northbound in Freetown. On May 27, 1988, 29-year-old Deborah Medeiros of Fall River was reported missing after a fight with her boyfriend in New Bedford. Although Deborah's boyfriend was initially a person of interest, he was ruled out as a suspect. 19-year-old Christina Montero was last seen sometime in May 1988. She's not been heard from since, though according to authorities she's presumed deceased. It's unclear why authorities believe this. However, given that this is an active, ongoing investigation, evidence is released on a need-to-know basis. Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, 34, was last seen sometime in June 1988 and was reported missing in December 1988. She lived near Christina Montero and, like Montero, remains missing to this day. Also, like Montero, she's presumed deceased with no indication given as to why this is the case. 36-year-old Nancy Lee Paiva of New Bedford was last seen walking home from Whispers Pub on July 7, 1988, following an argument with her boyfriend in the early hours. Her body was found on July 30, 1988, beside Interstate 195 in Dartmouth, lying on her back, with her feet pointed toward the highway. Authorities noted that the staging of her body was similar to how Deborah Medeiros was discovered, suggesting the same perpetrator. Naturally, her boyfriend was initially considered a suspect, but was eventually cleared of all suspicion. On July 11, 1988, 35-year-old Deborah Greenlaw DeMello was last seen in New Bedford. Her body was discovered on November 8, 1988, off the eastbound Reed Road ramp of Interstate 195 by a highway crew. Her clothing was scattered among tree branches, and she was found in possession of some of Nancy Paiva's belongings. 26-year-old Mary Rose Santos, from New Bedford, was dropped off near the downtown bus station on July 16, 1988, by her husband. She was last seen dancing at the old quarterdeck lounge about 5 hours later. Her body was eventually discovered on March 31, 1989, along Massachusetts Route 88 in Westport by two boys. Sandra Botello, 24, reportedly left her apartment at 11 p.m. on August 11, 1988, and never returned. She was the final victim to be discovered, found on April 24, 1989, in the woods along Interstate 195 in Marion. On September 4, 1988, 25-year-old Dawn Mendez was last seen leaving her apartment in New Bedford to attend a family christening. Her mostly skeletal remains were discovered on November 29, 1988, on the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195 by a sniffer dog. The investigation into these slayings was extensive, involving local and state law enforcement agencies. Several suspects were considered, including local attorney Kenneth Ponte, who had represented some of the victims in legal matters. Ponte was indicted for the slaying of one victim, 28-year-old Rochelle Doparala, but the charges were later dropped due to insufficient evidence. Another potential suspect, Anthony DeGrazia, was arrested for a variety of SA activities in the area. While he was out on bail, the authorities stated that he was the prime suspect in the New Bedford slayings. As a result of this, he was either slain, potentially by a loved one of the women, or taken out by his own hand. Notably, the authorities later retracted the statement that he was the quote-unquote prime suspect in this case. Perhaps the most intriguing theory revolves around a European serial perpetrator known as the Lisbon Ripper. Between 1992 and 1993, 3 women in Lisbon were found slain, their bodies bearing signs of vicious attacks. Speculation about a possible connection emerged because both cases involved victims of Portuguese ancestry. Some theorists propose that the Lisbon Ripper and the New Bedford highway killer could be the same individual, supported by the timeline and the supposedly eerily similar victim profiles. On a cold December afternoon in 1985, shoppers at a Kmart in Spanaway, Washington, found a distressed 2-year-old girl wandering alone in the parking lot. She was shivering in only a t-shirt and diaper, and her parents were nowhere in sight. When police gently asked the toddler where her mother was, the only clue she gave was a haunting reply that her mommy was, quote, in the trees. The crimes of 1985, later dubbed the Tube Sock Killings, remain a chilling mystery to this day. The mystery began months earlier, in the summer of 1985, with a weekend camping trip that ended in tragedy. On August 10th, 1985, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper and her boyfriend, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins left Tacoma for a quiet camping getaway. They went to Tule Lake in the foothills near Mineral, Washington, expecting a routine weekend trip. When they failed to return to work the following Monday, their families grew concerned and reported them missing. 4 days later, on August 14th, hikers in a remote wooded area came upon a disturbing scene. Stephen Harkins was found shot to death, still zipped in his sleeping bag, as if ambushed while he slept. Nearby, the couple's dog was also found shot. There was no sign of Ruth, leading searchers to conclude she had also fallen victim to whoever committed these sick acts. 2 months passed with no answers. Then, on October 26, 1985, a human skull was discovered about 1.5 miles from the campsite. Dental records confirmed it belonged to Ruth Cooper, and 2 days later her skeletal remains were found about 50 feet from that spot. In a grim detail that became central to the case's infamy, a white tube sock was tied around Ruth's neck. The autopsy determined she had most likely been cut down by a gunshot wound to the abdomen. This baffling clue, the tube sock, offered no immediate explanation, but it set the Cooper-Harkins case apart instantly. 2 months later, on December 12, 1985, another couple ventured into the woods near Tacoma. That morning, 36-year-old Mike Reamer, his 21-year-old girlfriend Diana Robertson, and their 2-year-old daughter Crystal drove out to chop down a Christmas tree. Later that day, little Crystal was found wandering alone outside a Kmart in Spanaway. She was placed in temporary care until her grandmother recognized her after seeing a news report a few days later. Once reunited with family, Crystal repeated her ominous line about her mother being in the trees, but being only 2 years old, she couldn't say anything more. Authorities launched a massive search of the woods where Mike and Diana had gone, but no trace of the couple or their red pickup truck was found. For over 2 months, Crystal's parents' fate remained an unsolved mystery. Then, on February 18, 1986, a motorist on a remote logging road near Mineral spotted Mike's abandoned pickup truck partly buried in snow. Nearby, lying in the woods, was the body of Diana Robertson. The autopsy showed that she had been stabbed, and around her neck there was yet another tube sock, just like with Ruth Cooper. Inside the truck, police found blood on the seat and a manila envelope on the dashboard with a handwritten message reading, "I love you, Diana." But Mike Reamer had vanished, and even after the snow melted, no sign of him could be found. With the discovery of Diana's body, detectives realized the earlier campsite killings were likely connected. In both cases, a female victim was found with a white tube sock tied around her neck in the same unusual way. Investigators believed the predator brought these socks to the scenes, since they didn't belong to the victims. The crimes took place in remote forest locations and targeted outdoorsy couples, suggesting a single perpetrator with a frightening modus operandi. However, linking the cases by this clue did not reveal the serial killer's identity. The isolated wilderness crime scenes yielded few other clues, and in 1985, forensic tools like DNA profiling weren't yet available to assist. Police initially pursued two theories. Either an unknown serial killer was stalking young couples in the Washington woods, or Mike Reamer himself was behind the attacks. Under the latter theory, they believed that the first set of slayings may have been a smokescreen or a dry run for the attack on his girlfriend. With Mike missing, he naturally became the prime suspect, and disturbingly, he had a history of violence towards Diana. The cryptic note in the truck also raised suspicion as a possible farewell message if Mike had killed her and fled, though it could have been left by someone else to mislead investigators. They also found it suspicious that the sick puppy who committed these terrible acts spared Crystal. Police felt they had enough evidence against Mike, but since he was missing, they could not determine if he was even alive to face charges. Police and volunteers combed the woods and rivers for any sign of Mike for weeks, but no trace of him turned up. With no body and no new leads, the investigation eventually stalled. In the end, no other suspect emerged, and the predator remained at large. Mike's family vigorously denied that he could have been involved, stating that he wasn't a violent guy, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Years passed, and the Tube Sock killings case stayed unsolved. In 1989, it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, bringing national attention, but no breakthroughs followed. A major development finally came in 2011, when a hiker stumbled upon a partial human skull about a mile from where Diana's body had been found. Dental records identified it as Mike Reimers. This grim discovery confirmed Mike had died in the woods as well, but it didn't reveal whether he was a victim or the culprit. His partial skull showed no bullet wound, and authorities couldn't determine how he died or when. Unfortunately, this did little to prove whether he was the perpetrator or yet another victim of an unknown serial offender. Cold case detectives later revisited the case with modern forensics, attempting to see if Mike was responsible. Unfortunately, these results were never released to the public, and the case remains officially open. To me, these two factors suggest that Mike likely wasn't responsible, though the genetic evidence could have been too degraded to take a meaningful sample at the time. Unfortunately, as of now, it appears that the sick predator responsible for these 4 acts may still walk amongst us. In the spring of 1997, police in Mons, Belgium made a nightmarish discovery: a cluster of garbage bags filled with severed human limbs dumped along a quiet road. This gruesome find was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more bags of body parts appeared around the city, deliberately placed where they would be easily found. It quickly became clear that a serial predator was at work, one whom the press would soon nickname the Butcher of Mons. Between early 1996 and the summer of 1997, 5 women vanished in and around Mons without anyone connecting their cases. Their disappearances only made sense after the killer began revealing his disturbing handiwork in March 1997. On March 22nd of that year, 9 trash bags stuffed with dismembered human remains were discovered beneath a secluded street. Shockingly, the bags contained body parts from 3 different victims, a deliberate mixing that made identification difficult. The very next day, a 10th bag turned up on the same street, in an area that had already been searched, almost as if the killer was watching and taunting the investigators. In the following weeks, more grotesque packages appeared at various dump sites around Mons, including along local rivers and quiet back roads. In total, around a dozen garbage bags containing the remains of all 5 missing women were ultimately recovered across the area. Each location seemed chosen for effect. Many sites had ominous or symbolic names. For example, one bag was left on Chemin de l'Inquiétude, or the Path of Worry. Others were placed near the River Haine, French for hatred. It was as if the killer was playing a twisted game, placing body parts in places that literally signified fear and dread. Investigators also noted that the perp often left the bags in plain sight and seemed to delight in dumping more bags right after the police searched the area. This suggested that he viewed himself as playing a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game with the authorities. It also suggested that he was near the scene watching the cops work, and may even have had the bags on his person at the time. All 5 known victims were local women from the Mons area, and each had struggled with personal difficulties while frequenting the city's train station district. The first was Carmelina Russo, 42, who disappeared on January 4th, 1996. A few weeks later, her severed pelvis was found floating in the Scheldt River over the French border, a discovery not initially linked to a broader pattern. In July 1996, Martine Bone, a 43-year-old escort from France, went missing. That same month, her torso was pulled out of the Haine River near Mons. The grisly series truly came to light after Jacqueline Leclerc, 33, vanished just before Christmas 1996. She was a mother of 4 who had fallen on very hard times. On March 22, 1997, a police officer found trash bags containing Jacqueline's arms and legs. Soon after, more remains surfaced that were later identified as Natalie Godart, only 21, who had disappeared in early 1997. The final known victim was Begonia Valencia, 37, who went missing in mid-1997. Her skull was eventually discovered in a village on the outskirts of Mons. Belgian authorities launched a special task force in 1997 to hunt the butcher. Due to an odd bureaucratic decision, and despite the arguably transnational nature of the attacks, the government refused to make the case a national priority. This meant that the special task force was chronically underfunded, and at times only had a handful of officers working part-time on the case. They were denied all assistance from federal authorities and investigators, and despite working around the clock, couldn't meaningfully process the thousands of tips they received. Ironically, the local police had to seek help from the FBI's profilers, since their own national police force wouldn't provide one. These American investigators were more than happy to fill the gaps where Belgian national officials had failed. The profile that emerged was of a calculating offender who could charm vulnerable women, likely had a job with flexible hours and a private space to carry out the crimes. He may have been known as a well-paying, well-groomed, respectful customer amongst these women. Notably, the humiliation associated with having local police going to America to beg for help when the national police force wouldn't lift a finger led to significant outrage. Personally, I have to question whether the national police would have deemed this a local matter if the predator hadn't been targeting women on the outskirts of society. This national outrage would force the Belgian government to reverse course and rightly treat the case as an issue of national interest, with all the resources that entailed. Regardless of the profile and despite exhaustive legwork, the investigation hit one dead end after another. Over the years, multiple suspects were interrogated, but none could be conclusively tied to the slayings. One local man in Mons raised suspicions when police learned he had allegedly bragged about eliminating local escorts. A search of his home revealed an unnaturally pristine cellar and, disturbingly, digital photos of one of the dump site locations on his computer. Yet even this eerie evidence wasn't enough for an arrest, and no solid forensic evidence tied him to the crimes. Investigators remained divided on whether this was a mentally unwell person who wanted to insert himself into the investigation, or whether he was the one actually responsible. For reasons you're about to see, though, despite how guilty this guy looks, there's one very significant reason to believe he was just a sicko who wanted the attention. The most infamous suspect was an international one, Esmail Tulia, a Montenegrin man with a history of violence. In 2007, acting on a tip, authorities arrested Tulia in Montenegro on suspicion that he might be the butcher. Disturbingly, he had butchered his wife in New York City in 1990 and was on the run for that crime. During his period on the run, he had lived in Mons at some point in the 90s, though given his fugitive status, pinning down his exact location was difficult. Given the lack of any solid evidence, Montenegro refused to extradite him, though he would spend the rest of the short remainder of his life in prison for slaying his wife. Tulia died in a Montenegrin prison in 2012, maintaining that he had never done anything to the women in Belgium. Disturbingly, he is also suspected of slaying 2 women in Albania. suggesting a much wider pattern of predatory offenses. Decades later, the Butcher of Mons case remains one of Belgium's most chilling unsolved mysteries. The passage of time hasn't erased the community's memory of these crimes, and families of the victims still hope for answers. In 2022, Belgian officials affirmed that the investigation remains active, albeit with only a small team on the file. Disturbingly, Belgian law imposes a 30-year statute of limitations even on crimes as severe as this, which I find to be highly questionable for violent offenses. If the butcher isn't charged by 2027, the window is expected to permanently shut on the ability to bring this predator to justice, assuming he didn't die in a Balkan jail in 2012. Hey everyone, just a reminder that there's also a YouTube membership and a Patreon, and you can support my work for as little as $1 a month. Also, don't forget to click the share button and send this video to your friends and family that are interested in true crime topics. Florida has long served as a grim setting for some of America's most depraved criminals, but few figures embodied such a profound betrayal of public trust as Gerard Schaefer. Known chillingly as the Killer Cop, Schaefer weaponized the authority granted to him by the state. He wore a badge and a crisp uniform, exploiting the very trust he was sworn to uphold to lure, abduct, and eliminate young women in the swamps and backwoods of the Sunshine State. But for all the terror he inflicted, the true extent of his rampage remains an unsolved mystery, even decades later. Schaefer's turbulent childhood and subsequent failure in conventional life appear to have been foundational to his later pathology. Born in Wisconsin in 1946, he spent his youth frequently relocating. He described his early life as troubled, attributed in part to his father's alcoholism and everything that came with that. Despite being an outwardly promising student and an avid outdoorsman, even aspiring to be a forest ranger, Schaefer harbored increasingly dark private obsessions. By his mid-teens, he developed intense, deviant thoughts focused towards women. Before pivoting to law enforcement, Schaefer attempted a career in education, likely in hopes of access to potential victims. He enrolled in college and achieved average grades while aiming for a teaching degree. However, this career path dissolved quickly. Schaefer was fired from 2 separate student teaching internships in 1969 and 1970. Superiors noted his arrogance, poor subject knowledge, and his persistent efforts to impose his weird moral and political opinions on his students. The eventual decision to join the Martin County Sheriff's Department in 1972 was highly calculated. Schaefer successfully obtained the position despite forging a letter of recommendation, which is disturbing in and of itself. The analysis of his life suggests this move wasn't a genuine career aspiration, but rather a mechanism to gain the authority over others he desired so much. The badge provided immediate, absolute power and a perfect disguise for luring victims, particularly hitchhikers or women in vulnerable circumstances. Schaefer's criminal career was brought to an abrupt halt following the astonishing escape of 2 young women in 1972. While serving as a deputy, Schaefer abducted 2 girls. Both were subjected to horror, yet they miraculously managed to escape separately. One girl was found staggering through the woods, and approximately 45 minutes later, officers found the other distressed near a riverbank, her clothing shredded. Their harrowing survival proved to be the pivotal moment in Schaefer's downfall. The surviving victims became crucial witnesses in Schaefer's subsequent trial in 1973 for the slaying of 2 teenage girls. Although Schaefer pleaded not guilty, maintaining a cold and aloof demeanor throughout the proceedings, the state presented a compelling case. The abductees not only testified about their abduction, but critically, reenacted on video the precise methods Schaefer used to bind them. This unusual signature technique provided a concrete link between the 2 survivors and the 2 girls whose lives he had cut tragically short. Schaefer was convicted and sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment. Unfortunately, the evidence gathered suggested there had been many more victims. The physical evidence recovered from his property strongly suggests a much larger scale of depravity, cementing his status as a prolific predator linked to as many as 30 killings. During the search of his residence, investigators found more than just circumstantial evidence. They uncovered the trophies of a classic serial killer. The investigation yielded a trove of disturbing personal effects belonging to missing women, which served as relics of his sick acts. These items included a gold locket inscribed with the name Lee, which belonged to Lee Hainline Bonadies, a former neighbor who had been missing since September 1969. Also recovered were a driver's license belonging to Barbara Ann Wilcox and a passport belonging to Colette Marie Goodenough, both of whom vanished in January 1973. The presence of these belongings confirms that Schaefer actively collected mementos to psychologically relive his disturbing acts. Most damningly, authorities recovered teeth and sections of bone on his property that were later identified as belonging to at least 8 distinct victims. This discovery of physical human remains, combined with the multiple pieces of identification, linked him to these missing women. This provided overwhelming forensic support for the theory that Schaefer was an active and highly successful serial predator. By May 1973, investigators had assembled sufficient physical and circumstantial data to connect Schaefer to approximately 28 individuals. The span of his suspected crimes stretched from October 1966 to January 1973. The most terrifying evidence recovered wasn't forensic in the traditional sense, but literary. Police uncovered over 300 pages of gruesome writings penned by Schaefer. Written from the perspective of a killer known as the Ghoul, the stories contained meticulous details of kidnapping and execution. These writings, which prosecutors strongly suggested were thinly veiled accounts of his actual crimes, offered profound insight into Schaefer's psychological structure. He was categorized as a textbook case of the classic serial killer whose personality was driven by hatred and violence. Serving 2 life terms, Schaefer was incarcerated at Florida State Prison, where he remained obsessed with control. Even behind bars, he exerted power through manipulative lawsuits and by continuing to author quote-unquote fictional works. A particularly telling indicator of his grandiose narcissism was his perceived rivalry with fellow inmate, the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. Schaefer reveled in his own brutality, reportedly taunting Bundy as an inferior predator who couldn't compete with him. At the same time, the authorities had been working hard behind the scenes to bring further charges against him for all his crimes. But it turned out that this wouldn't be necessary, and a brutal form of prison justice would ultimately be the end of this prolific predator. Also, there's a certain cope involved in Schaefer claiming to be the superior predator to Bundy, since Schaefer clearly wanted some of the recognition Bundy had and has. After all, Schaefer, despite the breadth of his sick acts, is virtually completely unknown. Schaefer's reign of terror definitively ended on December 3, 1995, inside Florida State Prison. Now, normally I don't go into gruesome details, but I'll make a little exception here for this sick puppy. Schaefer was found dead in his cell at age 49, having been stabbed over 40 times in the face, head, neck, and body, with his throat also slashed. Officially, a fellow inmate, Vincent Faustino Rivera, killed Schaefer during an argument, purportedly over a cup of hot water. However, a broader understanding of his prison history suggests this may have been an act of retribution. Schaefer was suspected of being a prison informant, and in the year leading up to his death, he had already been targeted by inmates who repeatedly hurled literal crap at him. They also set part of his cell on fire, and some have speculated that prison guards weren't too inclined to put themselves at risk to intervene in his defense. Interestingly, the families of some of his victims came out in favor of this act, viewing the prisoners as having done what the state that empowered him never did. In my view, the lack of further convictions in the Schaefer saga says less about the strength of the evidence and far more about the uncomfortable position the state found itself in. Once the full scope of his crimes began to surface, every additional charge risked reopening an embarrassing truth. Florida had handed a badge, a gun, and institutional legitimacy to a man who never should have made it past the first interview. His forged recommendation letter wasn't subtle, his behavioral red flags weren't hidden, and his short, chaotic history and teaching already showed a pattern of inappropriate conduct. Yet he was hired anyway, granted authority immediately, and allowed unlimited access to vulnerable people. Pursuing dozens of additional cases would have required putting that failure front and center. Each new indictment would have invited another round of scrutiny about how a man with such glaring psychological and professional defects was ever empowered as a deputy. And after his 1973 convictions locked him away for life, I personally suspect that the incentive to keep digging evaporated. With Schaefer dead in 1995, the system quietly closed the door. It was easier to let the unanswered cases remain in the shadows than to acknowledge how deeply he'd exploited the uniform the state gave him. Imagine a killer so notorious, so feared, that the state, upon his death, decided not just to bury him, but to disassemble him. Matti Haapoja, Finland's most infamous serial predator of the 19th century, was confirmed to have killed only 3 people during his decades-long rampage. Yet reasonable historical estimates suggest his true victim count could soar as high as 30. In 1895, after a life marked with brutal violence, he claimed his final victim inside a prison cell in Turku, Finland. But the story doesn't end there. In a chilling demonstration of state power attempting to finally contain his defiance, his remains became institutional property. His physical relics, including patches of his skin, were collected for the Prison Administration Museum, turning the notorious villain into an enduring, macabre cultural artifact. This unusual act solidified his status. Haapoja was never just a criminal. He was a symbol whose myth had to be literally contained and displayed. Also, I know I have more than a few Finnish viewers, so I apologize for my pronunciations, but your language is literally impossible for me to pronounce. Matti Haapoja was born in 1845 in Isokiro, located in the tumultuous region of southern Ostrobothnia, and grew up in the nearby area of Listaro. He was the son of a farmer. His early life unfolded within a unique and violent social environment known as the Puukkojunkkarit, or knife fighters. This phenomenon, which peaked between the 1820s and 1880s, was characterized by widespread brawling, theft, and antagonism toward authority. Criminologists have long understood that this violence stemmed from deep-seated social frustration. Economic conditions in Ostrobothnia meant that land could not be endlessly distributed, creating a large population of younger, landless men who couldn't inherit their own farms. This frustration was often expressed through aggression, particularly at large, alcohol-fueled social gatherings like weddings. Haapoja quickly embraced this subculture, beginning his criminal trajectory as a brawler and notorious horse thief. Records show he non-fatally wounded at least 6 men in knife fights. For Haapoja, violent acts weren't just opportunistic crimes, they were markers of identity and power. In the community of knife fighters, the ultimate status symbol was to kill or wound another respected fighter. He openly sought recognition within this anti-establishment framework, reportedly declaring himself the king of all these gangs. His first known homicide occurred on December 6, 1867, when he fatally stabbed his drinking partner, farmer Heikki Impinen, during a drunken altercation. For this slaying, Hapoya received a 12-year sentence to hard labor at the Turku Penitentiary. The sentence began a cycle of imprisonment and defiance that defined the rest of his life. From 1809 to 1917, Finland was controlled by the Russian Empire in a semi-autonomous personal union known as the Grand Duchy of Finland. The Grand Duke of Finland was the Russian Tsar, but the day-to-day governing of the country was largely left to the populace of Sweden, rather than being dictated from Russia. The repressive penal environment of 19th century Finland was inherited from the Russian authoritarian model. This was characterized by prisoners having virtually no rights and being worked to death in prison. This system would prove insufficient to contain Hapoya. Following his initial conviction, his defiance of authority only intensified. Over the subsequent decade, Hapoya became notorious for repeatedly escaping the Turku prison. He broke out 4 times and spent significant periods at large on each occasion. These continuous escapes were a direct dramatic challenge to the rigid state structure. Weirdly, considering the crimes he committed, he became something of a folk hero in his own lifetime, with his opposition to authority seen as an expression of Finnish nationalism. Of course, his actions while free clearly showed that he was no freedom fighter standing up against the Russian behemoth. His exploits were heavily reported and sensationalized by the contemporary press. In August 1876, a Finnish farmer caught him robbing his lands, and Hapoya beat him up and then shot him in the face. Later, in January 1879, Hapoya stabbed a farmer who attempted to place him under something like a citizen's arrest. His growing notoriety served as a psychological shield. The continuous cycle of escaping, committing new offenses, and evading capture generated widespread fear. The perception that Hapoya was unstoppable was so strong that even local populations often didn't dare report his wrongdoings to the authorities. People were afraid that if they turned him in, that he'd simply escape and exact his revenge. Media coverage didn't help, as they portrayed Matti Hapoya as something akin to a force of nature who couldn't be stopped. Hapoya's consistent failure to conform resulted in his eventual exile to Siberia for forced labor in the Imperial Russian version of a gulag. This period in the late 1880s marks the most obscure, yet likely the most prolific phase of his killing career, a phase that stretched his violence across the Russian imperial frontier. During his time in the Russian penal colonies, Hapoya is linked to a chilling cluster of killings. These victims include an unidentified man in 1886, a Finnish convict known as Jaakko in 1888, and 2 men killed in the Siberian city of Tomsk in 1889. Speaking of 1889, that was a really prolific year for Hapoya. In that year, he was seen hanging out with a Baltic German convict named Gustav Sepp. After going for a walk with Hapoya, Sepp was never seen again. However, since Hapoya never claimed to have killed him, some speculate that he helped Sepp escape the prison. In Finland, he generally was only violent to other knife fighters or to people he was trying to rob. Some have noted that the killings in Siberia appear to be more predatory, targeting other convicts and opportunistic victims in remote locations. These attacks in Siberia appear to have been done purely for the thrill of violence, rather than for any other reason. This transition indicates a move toward calculated serial violence, exploiting the complete chaos and systemic lack of oversight inherent in the distant Russian penal colonies. Because of the vastness of the empire and extremely poor documentation, finding out the true number of victims during this time is considered an impossible task for historians. Hapoya eventually found his way back to Finland, but his violent habits hadn't diminished. In October 1890, he committed what became arguably his most infamous documented crime, the strangulation of Maria Jimena Salo. This is his first known slaying of a woman, which many believe indicates that he had been committing these acts before and simply had never been caught. The Salo slaying immediately dominated the national press, and he was held in captivity pending trial. Driven by a hunger for sensational content and capitalizing on global anxieties about urban crime, journalists quickly equated Hapoya to Jack the Ripper. Hapoya's final acts of violence occurred within the walls of the state institutions he had spent his life fighting. On October 10, 1894, his criminal span concluded with a fatal attack on prison guard Juho Rosted, whom Hapoya stabbed to death. In 1895, just as he was about to be sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, he decided to end it all. Some have interpreted this as a last defiant snub to the authority of the court. Matti Hapoya was ultimately found guilty of only 3 slayings, spanning the years from 1867 to 1894. However, the shadow cast by his exploits suggests that the official tally represents only a fraction of his true toll. A figure often repeated in folklore and historical accounts claims that Hapoya confessed to 18 killings. Critically, there are no documented details concerning this supposed confession, leading experts to regard the figure as unreliable. But here's the thing. Based upon a review of the limited records we have from his time in Siberia, many historians think that this number, made up to sound high, is actually too low. Despite the lack of firm evidence for the confession, the most credible historical estimates place his overall victim count much higher than the confirmed 3. Many believe that he may have killed between 20 to 30 people over the course of his life. This broad estimate acknowledges the likelihood that unreported attacks, especially from his Siberian period, is extremely high. Anyway, to the surprise of no one, I'm not fluent in Finnish, and I had to rely on translation software when looking at sources since there isn't much out there in English. It seems to me that Hapoya, despite his disturbing crimes, has a folkloric status, kind of like someone like Billy the Kid for us. If you're Finnish, it would be great if you could confirm or deny this, since the language barrier and limited English sources made it difficult for me to figure this out. Between October 1978 and January 1979, the Los Angeles neighborhood of Skid Row became the stage for a brutal reign of terror. An assailant, later dubbed the Skid Row Stabber, systematically targeted and slaughtered up to 12 people using a knife. For decades, the case was considered closed following the 1984 conviction of Bobby Joe Maxwell, who received a life sentence without parole. Yet, this legal resolution was, in fact, a profound miscarriage of justice. Due to systemic constitutional violations, Maxwell's conviction was overturned in 2010 by a federal appeals court. In 2018, the Los Angeles County Prosecutor's Office formally dropped all charges. This startling turn confirmed a disturbing truth. The Skid Row Stabber, the individual who terrified the downtown core, had successfully evaded justice. The killer's selection criteria were narrowly focused, preying exclusively on homeless men, whose bodies were found dumped in alleyways close to one another in the Skid Row area. The spree, spanning approximately 3 months, exhibited an alarming intensity and frequency. It began on October 23, 1978, with the death of Jesse Martinez, and concluded with the death of Luis Alvarez on January 21, 1979. By the time his reign of terror appeared to have come to an end, the stabber had claimed either 11 or 12 lives. The geographical proximity of the crime sites, alleyways in Skid Row and even near Los Angeles City Hall, is highly significant. This clustering suggests the offender had an intimate knowledge of the area's routines and landscape, establishing a defined comfort zone for his attacks. The common scenario involved targeting sleeping homeless people, suggesting a premeditated strategy focused on selecting the most defenseless victims. The attacker likely knowingly took advantage of the fact that his targets lived on the outskirts of life, and that the first stabbings would likely just be written off by police. Crucially, the initial investigation yielded a very distinct behavioral profile that was later completely discarded in the rush to prosecute Maxwell. During the investigation of the killing of David Jones on November 9, 1978, witnesses, friends of the victim, reported interacting with the killer for several minutes prior to the attack. They described the assailant as a 30-year-old Afro-Latino man who spoke with a thick Puerto Rican accent and identified himself simply as Luther. This identity was corroborated months later. In January 1979, an absolutely chilling inscription was discovered in a Los Angeles bus terminal washroom. It read, "My name is Luther. I kill winos. I put them out of their misery." And I have to mention here that the Luther identity wasn't released or leaked to the public, making this much more likely to have been written by the predator himself. This self-authored statement provided a clear indicator of the killer's psychological framework. The perpetrator viewed the killings as a mission. He saw himself as engaging in a form of moral purging of alcoholics. Based on this evidence, the Skid Row stabber appears to fit the profile of a mission-oriented serial killer. The ability to engage in conversation with witnesses before the attack suggests a level of social competence, indicating the killer was not entirely disorganized or socially inept. Despite the evidence, Bobby Joe Maxwell, a laborer who had moved to Los Angeles from Tennessee in 1977, became the primary suspect. His connection to the crimes was highly circumstantial, resting primarily on a single palm print found near the body of victim Frank Garcia, which was traced to Maxwell. Further suspicion arose from the observation that the spree temporarily halted while Maxwell was incarcerated for several weeks in December 1978. Interestingly, this arrest was for disturbing the peace and menacing people with a knife, so he was clearly no angel. To build a prosecutable case, investigators searched Maxwell's apartment, seizing his diaries and letters, which they then used to declare that Maxwell was a Satanist. This sensational narrative, unsupported by direct forensic evidence, served to provide a compelling, albeit fictional, explanation for the random brutality. This narrative that he was a crazed Satanist influenced the jury to believe that he was capable of the crimes. However, this alone wouldn't have been enough. The 1984 conviction for 2 of the Skid Row stabbings rested almost entirely on the testimony of Sidney Storch, a 37-year-old career felon. This jailhouse snitch served as Maxwell's cellmate for 3 weeks. And yes, if you're a longtime viewer, you probably know I'm about to dunk on this guy's credibility. Storch claimed Maxwell confessed to the killings, even providing details about forgetting to wear gloves, an attempt to explain the palm print evidence. Storch, however, was a documented habitual liar with an extensive criminal history, known for gross deception, including impersonating intelligence officials. Storch's involvement was later exposed as part of a wide-ranging jailhouse informant scandal that rocked the Los Angeles County justice system. He was a serial snitch known to familiarize himself with case details through media reports and then fabricate confessions. Why Storch did this was unknown for years, though he claimed everything he said was true and claimed that his rabbi informed him of the moral consequences of not telling the truth. But this wasn't true, and it appeared that no such conversation with any such rabbi ever occurred, and he simply wanted to provide a religious shield to his true actions. In essence, he hoped that when people heard that his decision to become a snitch resulted from a religiously motivated change of heart, people wouldn't question it further. In truth, it was later revealed Storch had secured a hidden deal with prosecutors for an early release from prison. This was contingent on his testimony being accepted and the prosecution getting wins on the cases that he gave quote-unquote evidence on. Furthermore, prosecutors had raised concerns about Storch's reliability before the trial, but these doubts were never revealed to Maxwell's defense counsel. They had evidence to suggest that Storch was making it all up, but simply never disclosed this to defense counsel, in violation of Maxwell's rights. After decades of appeals, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned Maxwell's conviction in 2010. The ruling explicitly stated that the case against Maxwell was based on lies from a notorious jailhouse snitch and emphasized the fundamental lack of physical evidence. In the meantime, this allegedly very helpful snitch had died while still in prison, never getting that sweet release he was hoping for. Facing an unwinnable case with their key witness both dead and discredited, the Los Angeles County Prosecutor's Office formally dropped all charges in 2018. However, the legal system's ultimate finding of innocence came too late. Bobby Joe Maxwell spent over 30 years incarcerated for crimes he almost certainly didn't commit. In late 2017, while still awaiting retrial, he suffered a severe heart attack that left him comatose. Though he was formally exonerated in August 2018, he remained unconscious, never regaining the ability to recognize or benefit from his freedom until his death in April 2019. The case of the Skid Row stabber is a profound and lasting indictment of the justice system's systemic failure. By knowingly leveraging fabricated evidence against an innocent man, the state secured public closure in 1984. The only problem is that this conviction came at the obvious cost of the truth, and the real serial predator, the man known as Luther, has never been caught. There's a very real possibility that Luther didn't simply stop in January 1979. Mission-oriented predators almost never age out abruptly, and nothing in his demonstrated psychology suggests he would have felt his quote-unquote work was done. If anything, the sudden end to the Skid Row cluster may indicate he thought the heat in the kitchen was getting a bit too hot. Increased patrols, media attention, or a near encounter with witnesses could have pushed him to shift neighborhoods, cities, or even states. In fact, given that there's strong evidence to suggest that he was Puerto Rican, he may have moved to the territory. There's always the possibility as well that he fled to Latin America and may have resumed his crime spree there. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that Luther may have learned his lesson about committing crimes so frequently. If he was a transient himself, he may have realized that he could take his show on the road, perhaps committing a single crime in a city before moving along. Hey everyone, just dropping in with a quick reminder to hit that notification bell and the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Also, I haven't mentioned this for a while, but there is a podcast available for this channel, and I've included a link to it in the description. The term golden years is meant to evoke a sense of peace, a well-earned reward of quiet comfort after a long life. It's a time for front porches, familiar neighbors, relaxing with family, and the safety of home. But between 1990 and 1996, in the historic West End of Richmond, Virginia, that promise was shattered. For at least 13 elderly women, their golden years became a season of unimaginable terror, their homes transformed from sanctuaries into mortuaries. This is the story of the Golden Years slayings, and a horror which began on July 1st, 1990, when 89-year-old Mabel Venable was found cut down inside her house. It was a brutal, shocking crime that served as a dark omen of the 6-year nightmare to come. Following the slaying of Mabel Venable, A chilling and specific pattern began to emerge. Over the next 2 years, 5 more elderly women were eliminated in their homes, each attack bearing the same terrifying signature. The victims were all black women, ranging in age from 61 to 85, who lived by themselves. The list of the dead grew steadily. 80-year-old Eva Jones and 61-year-old Mary Coffey in October 1990, 61-year-old Robinette Mickleberry in May 1991, 85-year-old Pearl Gash in December 1991, and finally, 81-year-old Martha Bolden in May 1992. The method in each of these first 6 attacks was consistent and brutal. The women were stabbed. This consistent modus operandi suggested a single predator was at work, a perpetrator with a clear and horrifying preference for a specific type of victim. The community was paralyzed by a unique kind of fear that can only be evoked from violating the home. Then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. For 2 years, an uneasy silence settled over Richmond's West End. Residents wondered if the predator had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply moved on. But the monster hadn't vanished. It was merely dormant, and when it re-emerged, it would be terrifyingly different. On August 16, 1994, the uneasy peace was broken with the slaying of 59-year-old Phyllis Harris. The terror was back, but the perpetrator's signature had completely changed. The new victims, beginning with Harris, were all white women. Even more jarring was the change in method. He now preferred strangulation. After the slaying of 82-year-old Inez J. Childress in September 1994, the attacker once again went dormant for a time. Unfortunately, he would be back in 1996 to unleash a final terrifying onslaught. 5 women were slain in just 4 months. Lucille Boyd, 75, in January, Gertrude Gardner, 77, in February, Mamie Harris Verlander, 84, in March. Then, in the most brazen set of attacks, there was Elizabeth Seibert, 69, and Jane Foster, 55, on consecutive days in April. The rapid succession of attacks sent a fresh wave of panic through the city. As the body count rose, Richmond transformed into a city under siege. The slayings provoked widespread outrage, not just because of their brutality, but because of the victims' profound vulnerability. Fear became a tangible part of daily life, especially for elderly women. Sales of weapons, door locks, and guard dogs surged as residents took security into their own hands, no longer trusting that they were safe in their own homes. In some neighborhoods, citizens' patrols were formed with police assistance, a clear sign that public faith in the authorities' ability to protect them was eroding. In 2000, 4 years after the last attack, a suspect finally emerged, but he was far from the criminal mastermind some might have imagined. Leslie Burchart was a 51-year-old homeless man with a long and documented history of severe mental illness, including a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Burchart was already in prison, serving a life sentence for confessing to the slaying of 3 homeless men in 1996. Then, in 1999, he contacted authorities and confessed to 4 of the Golden Years attacks. He admitted to having taken the lives of the last 4 victims: Lucille Boyd, Mamie Verlander, Elizabeth Seibert, and Jane Foster. His confession was stunningly detailed. He provided information about the crime scenes that was supposedly known only to investigators, making his claims seem highly credible. For a police department under immense pressure, it was the breakthrough they desperately needed. However, the confession was built on a foundation of sand. Burchart was a man known to suffer from hallucinations and hear voices. Some believe that he may have been purposely or inadvertently fed information during the confession process. Others suspect that he may have talked to someone in prison who actually committed the disturbing acts. Compounding the doubt, shortly before he died in prison from natural causes in 2002, he recanted his confession entirely and proclaimed his innocence. Due to the lack of any physical evidence connecting him to the crimes, Burchart was never formally tried, though he remains the prime and only significant suspect. With Leslie Burchart dead and no forensic evidence to provide clarity, the Golden Years slayings remain a puzzle with several competing solutions. The first theory is that a single serial perpetrator was responsible for all 13 deaths. This would require a psychological explanation for the dramatic shift in both method and victim race, a change that is highly unusual for serial predators. A second, more plausible theory suggests that Richmond was plagued by at least two separate monsters, whose crimes were mistakenly linked by police. This is the theory that I strongly prefer, because personally, I'm not seeing the strong connection to the two sets of attacks that the cops see. Under this scenario, one predator slew 6 elderly black women between 1990 and 1992 and then disappeared. 2 years later, a different attacker, perhaps Burchart, began strangling elderly white women in the same geographic area. The only common thread was the age of the victims and the fact they lived alone, which may have led to a critical case of confirmation bias by investigators. A third theory suggests that the entire investigation was essentially botched, and we can't really know what is true or what isn't. This theory stems from 2013 claims of a retired detective named Ron Reed, who worked on the case. Reed alleged that his supervisors forced him to suppress parts of Burchart's testimony, fearing that more negative publicity would destroy the department's reputation. The police department officially denied this, but did state that the other deaths Burchart allegedly confessed to were determined to have been from natural causes. For instance, Reed had tossed in the name of a woman who was known to have died of natural causes in 1996, while in a nursing home under round-the-clock care. Burchart readily provided details about how he slew the woman in her home. This allegation, if true, paints a picture of an investigation where controlling the public narrative may have taken precedence over uncovering the full truth. Decades later, the dust has never settled in Richmond. The Golden Years Predator case remains officially unsolved. Leslie Burchart, the only person ever named as a suspect, will never face justice regardless, and it's unclear to what extent the cops continue to investigate the case. Whether this was one perpetrator or multiple perpetrators, the final injustice is the silence that continues to surround their deaths decades later. Imagine you're a traveler in southeastern Kansas in the early 1870s. The country still has the fresh scars of conflict and the promise of a new life, of 160 acres to call your own, has pulled you west. The landscape around you is an immense, unforgiving prairie. It's a lonely expanse where homesteads are scattered like islands in a sea of grass, and your nearest neighbor might be miles away. This is Labette County, a place carved out of land recently ceded by the Osage Nation, a place defined by both boundless opportunity and profound isolation. Your journey follows the Great Osage Trail, a path worn into the earth first by migrating buffalo, then by Native American tribes, and now by the wagons of settlers like yourself. It's a vital artery of westward expansion, but it's also a place of great danger. The weather is harsh and unpredictable, with tornadoes, blizzards, and floods that can erase a homesteader's dreams overnight. Violence is a constant threat, whether from conflicts with displaced tribes or from the battle-hardened American men who now work their way onto the frontier. In this vast emptiness, people simply vanish, and when they disappear, the prairie keeps their secrets. As dusk begins to settle, casting long shadows across the plains, you spot a light. It comes from a small one-room cabin, a welcome sign of life in the desolate landscape. A crude hand-lettered sign above the door reads, "Groceries." This is the Bender Place, a wayside inn offering the promise of a hot meal, supplies, and most importantly, a safe place to rest for the night. For a weary traveler, it seems like a sanctuary, a fragile outpost of civilization where the unspoken code of frontier hospitality offers a moment of peace. You approach, unaware that the trust you're about to place in these strangers is the last mistake you'll ever make. This humble cabin wasn't a refuge, it was a slaughterhouse, and for at least a dozen travelers, this beacon of hope on this great migratory trail was the end of the line. This is the disturbing story of the Benders, a supposed family of innkeepers who committed horrific actions before performing one of American history's greatest vanishing acts. To understand the horror that unfolded in Labette County, one must first try to understand the perpetrators. But the Bender family itself is an enigma, a collection of four individuals whose true identities, origins, and relationships remain a mystery. They presented themselves as a simple homesteading family, but they were a carefully constructed criminal conspiracy, a human machine where each member played a specific and deadly role. The patriarch, John Bender Sr., was a man of about 60, described by those who met him as a repulsive and brutish figure. He was a giant of a man, with piercing eyes and a sullen, ill-tempered demeanor. Like the other members of this so-called family, he claimed to be from Germany. As with all the members of the family, it remains unclear what their true origins were, as German was commonly spoken across Central and Eastern Europe. And to get in my one mandatory Simpsons reference per video, no one who speaks German could be an evil man, right? His wife, Elvira Bender, was around 55 and equally disliked by her neighbors, who called her a she-devil. Unfriendly and sinister, she was rumored to have slain previous husbands before arriving in Kansas, and she dabbled in folk magic, claiming to be a medium who could cast spells. While she claimed not to understand English, a moment of rage during a confrontation later revealed her command of the language was far better than she let on. The younger generation presented a stark contrast. John Bender Jr., about 25, was handsome and spoke English well, though with a German accent. He had a peculiar habit of laughing without cause, which led many in the community to suspect there was something wrong with him. This perception, whether genuine or an act, made him seem harmless and non-threatening, a perfect disguise for the violence he was capable of. The public face and undisputed star of the operation was Kate Bender. Around 23 years old, she was universally described as beautiful, intelligent, and intensely charismatic. She was fluent in English and was the only member of the family who actively engaged with the surrounding community. Kate was the family's lure, and her chosen bait was spiritualism. In an era when communicating with the dead was a popular and widespread belief, Kate advertised herself as a powerful psychic, healer, and spiritualist medium. She distributed flyers and gave lectures, claiming she could cure blindness and deafness with the laying on of hands, contact the spirits of the deceased, and locate lost possessions. Her lectures also promoted radical ideas like free love, which, while scandalous, only added to her notoriety and drew curious visitors to the family inn. And by curious travelers, I mean men traveling alone who definitely thought they had a chance with this frontier cutie. Kate's persona was the perfect tool for disarming travelers, and she was basically the honeypot that lured victims in. With her charm and supposed supernatural gifts, she could win their trust. This would draw them into intimate conversations where they would reveal their travel plans and, most importantly, their financial situations. The very foundation of this group was built on lies. While they were widely believed to be German immigrants, no official documentation of their origins, or even their real names, has ever been discovered. The name Bender itself, while a fairly common German name, was almost certainly an alias. Even their family ties were likely a complete fabrication. Neighbors reported that the intimacy between John Jr. and Kate seemed more like that of a husband and wife than siblings. The reason for doing this was also a part of their ruse. In a society built on the family unit, the image of a family-run inn offered a veneer of safety and respectability that was crucial to their predatory success. The Benders' genius for evil was not just in their deception, but in their engineering. They transformed their humble, one-room cabin into a highly efficient machine capable of quote-unquote processing guests. The cabin was a simple wooden structure measuring about 16 by 24 feet. Inside, they had made a simple but critical modification. A large, heavy canvas wagon cover was hung from a rope, splitting the single room in two. The front area was the public face of their operation, a small general store and a dining room where travelers could get a meal. The area behind the curtain was the family's private quarters, but its true purpose was to serve as a blind from which to launch their ambush. Their modus operandi was a chillingly refined process. After Kate identified a suitable victim, usually a man traveling alone with significant money, he would be invited to dinner and given the seat of honor at the table. This seat wasn't a gesture of hospitality, it was a tactical position. It placed the guest with his back directly against the canvas partition, perfectly silhouetting his head for the attacker waiting behind it. As the unsuspecting traveler ate his meal, captivated by Kate's charm and conversation, one of the male Benders would slip behind the curtain. At the right moment, the attacker would swing a heavy hammer, striking the victim on the back of the head with crushing force. Beneath the victim's chair, or immediately beside it, was a concealed trapdoor. The stunned or dead man was immediately dropped through the opening into a dark, stone-lined cellar that was 6 feet deep. This allowed for the instant removal of the body from the main room, minimizing mess and the risk of discovery should another guest arrive. The body was then stripped of every valuable before being disposed of. Under the cover of night, the bodies were removed from this subterranean abattoir and buried in the family's 2-acre vegetable garden and apple orchard just north of the cabin. In a particularly macabre detail passed down through local lore, it was said that Elvira Bender used the apples from the trees growing over her victims' graves to bake pies for future travelers. The Benders' reign of terror lasted for nearly 2 years, from May 1871 to the spring of 1873. During that time, they eliminated at least a dozen people, though the true number may be much higher. Their victims were the forgotten travelers of the frontier, men whose disappearances created distant ripples of concern, but no organized alarm until it was far too late. After all, Kate was an expert at finding men who were very far from home, and whose disappearances wouldn't be noticed for months or even years. The case that finally brought an end to the Benders' slaughter began with the disappearance of George Newton Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter Mary Ann in the winter of 1872. A recent widower, Longcore was traveling back to Iowa and was carrying a significant sum of money. When they vanished, Longcore's former neighbor from Independence, a physician named Dr. William York, became concerned and set out to find them in the spring of 1873. Dr. York's search led him along the Osage Trail and inevitably to the Bender Inn, where he, too, disappeared. The attack on Dr. York was the Benders' final overreach. For 2 years, they had preyed on the anonymous and the transient, individuals whose disappearances could be easily dismissed. Dr. York, however, was a prominent man, and more importantly, his brother was Colonel Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. Unlike the families of other victims, Colonel York had the influence, resources, and unwavering determination to mobilize a search and demand answers. In March 1873, Colonel Alexander York arrived at the Bender's Inn, methodically retracing his brother's last known movements. During his initial questioning, the family deployed their well-practiced deception. They admitted Dr. York had stopped there, but insisted he'd continued on his way. They casually suggested he might have fallen victim to an attack by a local tribe or by highwaymen, common and convenient explanations for such disappearances. Kate, the master manipulator, pretended to be deeply concerned and offered to hold a séance to contact his spirit, telling the colonel to return another day. She let him know that he needed to come back alone, in what was a brazen attempt to make the investigator their next victim. But Colonel York was not easily fooled, and he sensed a profound evil in the small cabin and left, deeply suspicious. His doubts were confirmed when he learned of another traveler, a woman who had recently fled the inn in terror after Elvira threatened her with a knife. York returned, this time with an armed posse of men that definitely weren't clowning around. The confrontation was tense, and Elvira's subsequent explosion of rage shattered her facade as a simple woman who couldn't speak English. This outburst further solidified Colonel York's conviction that the family was hiding a dark secret, but in the end, nothing happened yet. As York's investigation intensified, the wider community, already on edge from the string of disappearances, reached a breaking point. A town meeting was convened where dozens of local men gathered to decide on a course of action. They resolved to obtain a warrant and conduct a search of every single homestead in the township. In an act of astonishing audacity, the Bender men were also present at that meeting. They sat among their neighbors, listening as the community organized the very search that would inevitably unearth the bodies buried in their own garden. It was a final, desperate gamble to appear innocent, an attempt to deflect suspicion that was doomed to fail. The Benders knew the moment the vote was taken that their time was up. They could perhaps deceive a lone questioner, but they couldn't survive a systematic, official search of their property. Sometime in the days following the meeting, under the cover of the vast Kansas night, they packed what they could, abandoned their homestead, and vanished. Their escape was discovered a few days later when a neighbor noticed their farm animals were starving and the inn was eerily silent. Unfortunately, a spell of bad weather delayed a formal investigation, giving the Benders a crucial head start of nearly a month to disappear into the American frontier. When the search party finally forced their way into the abandoned Bender cabin in early May 1873, they were met with a scene of hurried departure and an overpowering stench of death. The source of the odor was quickly traced to a trap door under a bed, which had been nailed shut. After prying it open, they peered down into the stone-lined cellar. The pit was empty of bodies, but the floor was caked with so much clotted blood that it had soaked deep into the earth below, irrefutable proof that this had been a place of slaughter. The search then moved outside to the family's small apple orchard and vegetable garden. The ground in the orchard was soft and appeared to have been recently disturbed. The men began to probe the soil, and it wasn't long before they made their first horrific discovery, the body of Dr. William York, buried in a shallow grave. The news spread, and a full-scale excavation began. Over the next day, the searchers unearthed a graveyard. One by one, they uncovered the remains of at least 10 more people, including George Longcore and his infant daughter. The story of the Bender's House of Horrors became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to Chicago sent reporters to the remote Kansas prairie, and their lurid accounts of the Devil's Kitchen captivated the public. These accounts took the already horrific realities and added new fictionalized elements in an effort to sell more papers. After fleeing their farm, the Benders' trail quickly went cold. Investigators found their abandoned wagon near the town of Thayer, just 12 miles to the north. But from there, the trail vanished completely. A massive manhunt was launched, and the Kansas governor offered a $2,000 reward, a fortune at the time, for information leading to their capture. What happened to the Benders remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Old West, a narrative vacuum that has been filled with two powerful and competing theories. The first is that they simply got away. In the vast, unmapped expanse of 19th century America, it was entirely possible for four people to change their names, split up, and begin new lives without a trace. This theory is bolstered by the numerous false sightings and wrongful arrests that plagued investigators for decades. In 1880, a couple in Nebraska was arrested and even confessed, but they were soon exposed as imposters. In 1889, two women were arrested in Michigan and extradited to Kansas on suspicion of being Elvira and Kate, only to be exonerated when their alibis proved solid. These incidents reflect a public desperate for closure, but they also highlight how easily the fugitives could have blended back into society, either in America or elsewhere. The second, more pervasive theory is that the Benders met a swift and brutal end at the hands of a vigilante posse. According to this version of events, a group of enraged neighbors caught up with the family shortly after they fled. They dispensed their own form of frontier justice, forcing confessions from the Benders before eliminating them. While no physical evidence supports this story, it aligns with the harsh realities of the frontier, where communities often took the law into their own hands when official channels failed. The secrecy of such an extrajudicial act would neatly explain why no one ever came forward to claim the substantial reward. Today, more than 150 years later, the search for answers continues, and who the Benders were and what happened to them remains a historical, unsolved mystery. For decades, the slaying of three women in Toronto and its surrounding region haunted investigators and families with no answers or arrests. The cases of 25-year-old Christine Prince, 23-year-old Claire Sampson, and 41-year-old Gracelyn Greenidge were all unsolved cold cases. They were separate tragedies with seemingly nothing linking them beyond their brutality. Yet in late 2025, cops announced a shocking breakthrough. The killer in all three cases was the same man, a previously unknown serial predator named Kenneth Smith. Astonishingly, Smith had died years earlier in 2019, meaning the long-sought culprit was identified only after his death. This revelation brought both relief and frustration. Relief that the mystery was finally solved, but frustration that the perpetrator would never face justice in a courtroom. The cold case trail began in the early 1980s. Christine Prince, a 25-year-old woman from Wales working as a nanny in Toronto, vanished after a late-night outing in June 1982. She was last seen boarding a streetcar along St. Clair Avenue West just after 1 a.m. on June 21, 1982. The next morning, her body was discovered in the Rouge River near the Toronto Zoo. Christine had been subjected to a vile assault, after which she was struck on the head and then drowned. Despite an intensive investigation at the time, no suspect was identified, and the case eventually went cold. Just over a year later, in September 1983, another young woman met a horrific fate. Claire Sampson, 23, was last seen on the night of August 31st, 1983, near the downtown core. Witnesses recalled seeing her in front of the Essex Hotel on Jarvis Street, getting into a car with an unidentified man. To put it in context, if you're not from the city, this is the area of town that's produced a fast food restaurant known by locals as the Hooker Harveys. The following day, Claire's body was found dumped on a rural property off a side road in Oro Medonte Township, about 50 miles north of Toronto. Notably, that case was handled by the Ontario Provincial Police, meaning that an entirely different set of investigators were working the case. Claire had been shot twice, succumbing from her wounds. Like Christine's case, Claire's slaying remained unsolved, and police had no immediate evidence tying it to any other crime. Many years passed before the third victim lost her life under similar mysterious circumstances. Grace Greenidge, originally from Barbados, was 41 years old in the summer of 1997, living in the Jane and Finch area of Toronto and working as a nursing assistant. When Grace failed to show up for her shift on July 29, 1997, a concerned co-worker went to her apartment on Driftwood Avenue and found her dead. She had been brutally attacked and died of blunt force trauma. Once again, detectives collected evidence, but couldn't find the perp. At first, investigators saw no reason to connect these three attacks. The victims didn't know each other, and their backgrounds and ages differed markedly. The crime against Grace also happened nearly a decade and a half after the other two crimes. The methods of killing were also different. One woman was assaulted and drowned, another was shot, and the third was beaten to death. With no obvious pattern in crime scenes in different jurisdictions, the cases were handled independently. However, one common clue lay in storage all along: genetic evidence from the unknown attacker. For each victim, forensic teams had recovered samples believed to be the perpetrator's DNA. In 2016, decades after the slayings of Christine Prince and Claire Sampson, cold case detectives had crime scene DNA from those two cases reanalyzed. This led to a stunning discovery. The DNA profile from Christine's killer matched the profile from Claire's killer. For the first time, authorities realized they were dealing with a serial predator. A joint task force was formed to dig deeper into these linked cases, and in 2017, further testing linked that very same DNA to the killing of Gracelyn Greenidge as well. All three crimes, spanning from 1982 to 1997, were definitively tied to one person. Unfortunately, that DNA profile still didn't match any known individual in criminal databases. The killer remained unidentified, known only as a genetic fingerprint. With conventional investigative leads exhausted, Toronto Police and the Ontario Provincial Police turned to genetic genealogy to finally unmask the mystery man. In 2022, the team enlisted a specialized forensic lab to analyze the offender's DNA and search for relatives in public genealogy databases. The hope was that if distant cousins or other relatives of the unknown killer had uploaded their own genetic profiles online, and those could provide clues to his family tree. The gamble paid off. By late 2025, genetic genealogists identified a network of individuals related to the suspect's DNA. Working backward from those relatives, investigators zeroed in on a single name that fit the age and profile of the cold case killer: Kenneth Earl Smith. To confirm their suspicions, the Center of Forensic Sciences performed a direct DNA comparison between crime scene evidence and a sample from Smith. No word on how that was done, given that he was already deceased, but they were somehow able to get their mitts on his biological material. On December 3, 2025, the test results came back conclusive, and the DNA was a perfect match, identifying Kenneth Smith as the perpetrator in all three slayings. Far from a notorious criminal, Smith lived a largely unremarkable life that kept him off the public radar for the most part. He was born in South Porcupine, Ontario, and as a younger man, he resided in Toronto during the 1980s and 1990s, the period when he committed these crimes. Years later, in 2013, he moved to Windsor, Ontario. Smith died there of natural causes in 2019 at age 72, never having faced charges. Although he was never caught for his most serious crimes during his lifetime, Smith was very much known to police. He had a history of violence, with records showing he was convicted and incarcerated for disturbing assaults on women on multiple occasions. In fact, he served prison time both before the early 1980s attacks and again before the late 1990s slaying, indicating a pattern of criminal behavior punctuated by periods behind bars. Investigators now believe Smith chose his victims opportunistically, with no clear pattern or connection between them. They believe he may have intentionally chose women who were entirely different from one another and employed different methods to kill them. According to investigators, this may have been done because he knew that serial predators generally develop a profile of victims and a method by which they like to commit their sick acts. With Kenneth Smith exposed as a serial killer, police have widened their investigation to see if he could be linked to any other unsolved crimes. Investigators say it's possible that additional victims of Smith exist who have not yet been identified. They're urging anyone with information about Smith's activities or other cold cases from that era to come forward. From my perspective, it's almost impossible to believe Kenneth Smith stopped at 3 victims. What we know about his crimes doesn't suggest restraint, escalation control, or a single triggering event. It suggests opportunity, compulsion, and confidence. These attacks span 15 years, multiple jurisdictions, and radically different methods. That alone tells me he wasn't a man experimenting or learning, but rather someone who had actively figured out how not to be caught for his worst offenses. His modus operandi was, in essence, doing something different every time he went on the hunt for a victim. Given that he was originally from northern Ontario, and given how many unsolved disappearances there are in that neck of the woods, the authorities need to look heavily into crimes in that region. In 1982, fishermen discovered the stabbed body of 20-year-old Susan Becker in a Colorado mountain ravine. The man responsible was nowhere to be found, at least not by investigators at the time. In reality, the perp was a recently paroled convict who had already killed before and would kill again. This is the chilling story of John Agrew, a predator who evaded justice for decades. John William Agrew was born in 1947, and by age 18 he was already a killer. On July 21, 1966, Agrew lured his 15-year-old sister-in-law, Suzanne Marino, to a forest preserve in Joliet, Illinois. When she resisted his romantic advances, he snapped and stabbed her approximately a dozen times, brutally ending her life. That same day, Agrew shockingly confessed to his wife about the slaying, even driving her to the wooded crime scene to point out Marino's discarded purse and shoes as proof of his guilt. Urged by his wife to surrender, Agrew instead went to a church and confessed to a priest, who immediately alerted the authorities. He was arrested 2 days later and readily admitted he killed Susan because she had spurned him. With his confession and strong evidence, Agrew was swiftly convicted and given a 20 to 50-year prison sentence. The convict began serving his time in Illinois, but his criminal saga was nowhere near over. In late 1975, he was approved for a hospital visit in Chicago to donate a kidney to his sick sister, an event that presented an unexpected opportunity. On May 11, 1976, during his recuperation after the surgery, he slipped out of a bathroom window, fled the hospital, and stole a car to make his escape. He drove across state lines, using fake identities and switching stolen vehicles to evade capture. His taste of freedom lasted about a week. In mid-May 1976, police in Central City, Nebraska, spotted John Agrew with a stolen car and arrested him without incident. He was promptly extradited back to Illinois to finish his prison term, bringing his daring escape to an end. In January 1982, after serving roughly 15 years, this future serial predator was somehow paroled and moved to Colorado to live with relatives. He initially stayed in Boulder and later settled in Longmont. That summer, he crossed paths with 20-year-old Susan Becker near Boulder. Becker was a local young woman who loved the outdoors. She often went sunbathing in Boulder Canyon and was last seen by a friend on June 20th, 1982, heading into the mountains. In late June, Agrew ambushed Becker, stabbing her 13 times in the chest and neck before dumping her body in the wilderness of Boulder Canyon. Fishermen discovered Becker's remains on July 1st, 1982. Agrew was interviewed as a possible suspect, but investigators had no hard evidence linking him to the crime at the time. About a week after Becker's body was found, Agrew struck again. This time his victim was his 94-year-old neighbor, Orma Smith. Smith was a friendly widowed librarian who likely saw Agrew as a helpful new neighbor and trusted him. In early July 1982, Agrew invaded Orma Smith's apartment and brutally stabbed the defenseless woman to death. He then transported her body to a remote area in the Rocky Mountain foothills and left her in a creek bed. On July 9th, 1982, Smith's body was discovered in a stream, and Agrew was immediately suspected in Smith's killing. Once again, though, they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, and Agrew, despite committing 2 slayings in 2 weeks, remained a free man. On July 15, 1982, Agrew attempted a third violent crime on this spree, an abduction that would finally lead to his capture. He accosted a 26-year-old woman at knife point in a University of Colorado parking lot, trying to force her into her car. The woman fought back and managed to flag down a passing university employee for help, causing Agrew's plot to unravel. Police arrived and arrested Agrew on the spot. In 1983, he was convicted of the attempted kidnapping and received a prison sentence in Colorado. His Illinois parole was revoked as well, so Agrew was sent back to Illinois to serve out the remainder of his original sentence for the slaying. Disturbingly, he only remained incarcerated until 1989, after which he was released and settled quietly in Joliet, Illinois. During his later years of freedom, Agrew stayed off the official radar, and he wasn't linked to any new violent crimes. However, those who knew him noted his disturbing behavior, and he even bragged to his niece that he had once slain an elderly woman in Colorado. John Agrew died on June 29, 2009, at age 61, from an apparent accidental overdose of prescription medication at his home in Joliet. However, startling evidence came to light immediately afterward. While cleaning out his home, relatives found multiple women's purses and pieces of jewelry. They also found newspaper clippings about the 1982 slayings of Smith and Becker and the attempted abduction. These grim trophies strongly suggested Agrew's connection to the unsolved crimes and prompted investigators to take a fresh look. In 2010, detectives finally got the proof they needed, and they were able to test Agrew's DNA with genetic material found at the 2 1982 crime scenes. This evidence proved beyond a shadow of a cat's ass that John Agrew was the one who committed these horrific acts. Federal and state authorities began reviewing other unsolved killings in Illinois and Colorado from the years Agrew was free, investigating whether he could be linked to any further victims. However, as of 2025, no additional crimes have been definitively connected to him beyond the 3 victims already known. Hey everyone, just a reminder that there's also a YouTube membership and a Patreon and you can support my work for as little as $1 a month. You wake up in the dead of night, vulnerable and alone in a remote location, only to be confronted by the one figure you're trained to trust, a police officer. That symbol of safety, however, was twisted into the key that unlocked an isolated motorhome for a ruthless predator. The initial victims were Gord and Jackie McAllister, a couple from Lindsay, Ontario, enjoying their retirement travels in their motorhome. They chose a secluded picnic area near Blind River in northern Ontario for a peaceful overnight stop. Sleep came easily until 12:55 on June 28, 1991, when a heavy pounding shook their vehicle. The man outside identified himself as a police officer and insisted the couple needed to move their recreational vehicle. This pretense of law enforcement, a simple psychological tactic, successfully coaxed Jackie into opening the door, circumventing the need for forced entry. The assailant immediately barged inside, destroying the illusion of safety. He was armed with two powerful weapons, a high-caliber rifle and a 20-gauge shotgun, and he swiftly demanded money and valuables. Jackie reached for her purse in compliance with his demands, likely thinking this was going to be a horrific robbery, but nothing more. But then the true nightmare began to unfold as the gunman opened fire. Tragically, Jackie perished almost instantly. Gord McAllister was also shot, but in the chaos, he managed an extraordinary survival maneuver. He rolled out of the motorhome and hid underneath it, praying the attacker hadn't noticed his escape and would continue running after the initial assault. This decision saved his life and allowed him to bear witness to both what happened to his wife and what would happen next. While Gord lay hidden beneath his vehicle, a motorist drove into the isolated rest stop, likely just trying to get some shut-eye. This individual was 29-year-old Brian Major, a family man who left behind a wife and a young son. Major's unfortunate timing placed him squarely in the predator's path. The gunman instantly diverted his attention from the McAllister's vehicle, seeing Major as a new threat who had to be eliminated. The killer quickly shot Major dead before fleeing the area on foot. Once the assailant disappeared, Gord McAllister, despite his wounds, crawled out and rushed to the driver's seat of the motorhome. He drove immediately to the highway to flag down a passing trucker for help. Sadly, when emergency services arrived, both Jackie McAllister and Brian Major were pronounced dead at the scene. The sheer randomness and brutality of the incident terrified the small communities of northern Ontario, who quickly understood that a highly dangerous individual was now at large. The Ontario Provincial Police initiated an immediate and massive manhunt. The sole survivor, Gord McAllister, provided crucial information to investigators, working with them to develop a detailed composite sketch of the gunman. And seriously, this is perhaps the most bizarre and lifelike composite I've ever seen, so you're going to want to have a quick look if you're just listening. My understanding is that this composite was actually put together by a primitive computer program based upon Gord choosing a variety of features from actual people. A key lead materialized quickly. An eyewitness reported seeing a blue van speeding out of the rest stop area around 1 o'clock that morning, moments after the attack. The van was headed due east, traveling towards Sudbury, a small city in the vast rural expanse of northern Ontario. Given this valuable clue, the cops focused substantial resources on the van. The authorities investigated almost 4,000 blue vans in northern Ontario and across parts of the United States. However, despite this exhaustive search effort, the blue van and its driver vanished into the vast, desolate northern landscape. The failure to match the composite sketch or locate the specific vehicle meant the trail went cold almost immediately in 1991. While the active investigation stalled in 1991, the case never truly closed. For years, the Blind River Killer has remained a terrifying enigma. A breakthrough in Canadian cold case investigations came only years later, providing a possible, deeply unsettling answer to the identity of the man who terrorized the rest stop. Investigative focus eventually centered on Ronald Glenn West, a former Toronto police officer. West had been serving time for unrelated robberies in 1995 when authorities linked him, through preserved DNA evidence, to two killings in 1970. Notably, in both these cases, the attacker used the same sort of high-caliber rifle used at Blind River. The circumstantial evidence tying West to the 1991 rest stop attacks was compelling, despite his never being formally charged in connection with those specific deaths. West had lived in the Blind River area at the time of the 1991 attacks, and he somewhat fit the description used in the sketch. Notably, he had a history of impersonating an officer to gain control over victims, and he reportedly owned a blue vehicle, matching the crucial lead. Although West later pled guilty to the 1970 slayings, the deaths of Jackie McAllister and Brian Major have remained officially unsolved. At present, West is still alive and he's in his 80s. Fortunately, if he's the one who committed this horrific act, he's locked up for life. Unless he drops a deathbed confession, at this point it looks like the Blind River case may forever remain an unsolved mystery. There's a long stretch of asphalt, traversing the Hungarian plains, connecting cities and economies. It's called Main Road 4. But between 2007 and 2010, this ordinary national highway became something else entirely. The chilling reality is that a lone predator turned this critical transportation corridor into a systematic hunting ground, targeting vulnerable women who sought a living on the outskirts of society. The case of the Main Road 4 killer represents one of Hungary's most perplexing modern cold cases, involving multiple confirmed killings and at least one disappearance. Also, apologies in advance to anyone who speaks Hungarian, because I can assure you, I'll be mispronouncing every name to some degree, despite my best efforts. The victims associated with the Route 4 series share a common denominator. They were women engaged in illicit work along the highway, placing them squarely in a high-risk demographic. This inherent vulnerability played directly into the perpetrator's operational strategy, allowing him to select targets whose movements might not be immediately tracked. This also allowed him to easily get the victims into his vehicle without raising too much suspicion of a truly serious crime. The earliest known case involved a 34-year-old woman, identified only by her last name, Zoltan. She vanished in late summer 2007. As she was estranged from her family, her disappearance went unreported for several months, and her remains were eventually recovered in 2011. The violence intensified in 2010. A woman identified as Paraska, 24 years old, was slain on June 19, 2010. Disturbingly, she was a known regular along the highway, and someone had seen her alive just 15 minutes prior to the discovery of her body. 2 months later, on August 20th, 2010, 24-year-old Erzsébet was killed after leaving a local bar or nightclub. Her body was found the next day in a water ditch along the highway. The final known incident involved an 18-year-old named Angela, who disappeared on May 22, 2010, near Kharkag, also along the highway. A witness saw her entering a vehicle described as red or maroon, heading toward the city of Debrecen. Notably, all the attacks are believed to have occurred on a weekend, which suggested to the cops that the predator was constrained by his job duties from Monday to Friday. Hungarian criminal profilers were brought in to create a psychological portrait of the serial predator. Their findings suggested the victims were symbolic, serving as proxies onto whom the killer displaced rage, stemming from rejection experienced with women in his life. The analysis indicated the violence was intrinsically about the desire for dominance and revenge. According to this profile, he likely had the appearance of a normal life, despite the disturbing acts he routinely committed. They also agreed that he was almost certainly gainfully employed and likely wouldn't have any meaningful gaps in his employment history. He was also believed to live somewhere close to the highway and may have traveled along this route during his Monday to Friday commute. This may have been the time when he singled out the women he would ultimately target, and he may also have engaged in stalking behaviors on the weekend before striking. Despite the completion of this profile, this would ultimately bring the authorities no closer to cracking the case. Perhaps the most telling and frustrating piece of evidence in the case is the sudden stop after August 2010. Since a serial predator's actions are driven by overwhelming, constant psychological needs, it's highly improbable that the individual voluntarily stopped. An offender driven by such intense and deranged pathology rarely ceases activity unless they find a replacement behavior or are externally blocked. The abrupt end to the series of attacks strongly suggested an external involuntary situation prevented the continuation of his predatory behavior, at least according to officials. Investigators generated 4 primary theories to account for this silence, which are honestly just a list of everything that could have possibly happened. They speculated that he died, suffered a debilitating injury or serious illness, was incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or left the region or country permanently. That said, I do think it's possible that he stopped, and my evidence for this is that his attack on Angela was his last known crime. During that attack, someone saw his vehicle and got a description, which may have spooked the predator. His self-preservation instincts may have caused him to be one of the rare cases where a predator can simply stop his deranged spree. Despite the detailed behavioral profile and extensive efforts, the case of the Main Road 4 killer remains unsolved, with no suspects having been named. Unfortunately, it appears that no forensic evidence tied to the perpetrator was discovered at any of the crime scenes, which further complicates solving this crime. But even if his genetic material was discovered, cutting-edge techniques like forensic genetic genealogy just generally don't work in Europe for a variety of reasons. The primary one is European Union privacy laws, but also there's just much less reason for a Hungarian to seek out an ancestry test. After all, if all your Hungarian great-grandparents came from your Hungarian village, you're going to be much less inclined to pay a few $100 to find out you're Hungarian. Or maybe I'm totally misreading the situation and Hungarians are desperate to know that they're an 8th German or something,